today's younger generation, they will be working and living and studying in a world for the first time in modern history which is not dominated by the West anymore. The economic dominance will create the reserve currency. So in general, the biggest economy will have the reserve currency, but with quite a big time lag. So if you look at the UK, when it was dominating the world economics, the pound sterling was the reserve currency, clearly. And then it was taken over by the US in terms of economic dominance. So the US took over economic dominance already in the 1920s or so. But it took about 40 years before the dollar, or 50 years, before the dollar became the reserve currency. If you look at the US dollar, it's really dominating capital flows and trade flows. There are, of course, issues that certain countries are not using the dollar for geopolitical reasons, and they are using the euro for that in many aspects. So part of the market is now also taken over by the euro, but still the dollar is extremely dominant. And my expectation is that it will stay dominant for many decades to go. The market is just too big, and although China will become in economic dimension bigger than the US, it will take a while before you can take over the reserve currency status. Also because in China we don't have capital convertibility yet, and it is mostly built on trust. So there are initiatives that, for example, in the bilateral trade between China and Thailand, or China and South Korea, now we are using also the local currency for these bilateral trade flows. And these are small steps. But I don't think we are on the edge of a sort of structural change where we see less domination of the dollar. Now, if you look at an exchange rate system, obviously you can make a choice between floating system and a more managed or fixed system. And there is a trilemma happening in that. So if you have a fixed currency system and you want to have your own autonomy of your central bank using interest rate for domestic reasons, then you have to have capital protectionism, then you have to have capital restrictions. So that's the choice. If you have a fixed currency, you have to give up free capital flows. If you are moving into a floating system, then you can have free capital flows and you have your central bank autonomy, but then you don't have your fixed system. Then you have your floating system. So there's an impossible trilemma between a fixed system, capital convertibility, and central bank autonomy. You have to give up one of the three in one way or the other. Now in China, they choose for fixing the currency to the US dollar. And that means that they have to have capital restrictions. Otherwise the volatility will be too much to manage and to keep the currency within the margin towards the US dollar. So the choice for a fixed currency system makes it needed that there is capital inconvertibility, that there is no free capital flows. Now, a precondition for creating a reserve currency is clearly that there are free capital flows. But if you have free capital flows, you have to give up your fixed exchange rate system. And then your exchange rate is driven by market forces. And that may create a lot of volatility, sometimes up, sometimes down. A low currency value is helpful because it may create more export. But also it is importing inflation, because with the low currency exchange, import prices are going up relatively. So you may help export, but you are creating domestic inflation. If the currency is too high, you may reduce export. Export becomes very difficult, but import prices are being deflating because of that. So these are choices made by the government in terms of the currency system and the currency level. When I started working on my book, there was a feeling that I want to give my students, but also the audience, a flavor how the world is changing. And one of these aspects of the changing world is indeed that there is an enormous amount of catching up by emerging markets, and that these emerging markets are growing in a different way than what we did in the West. They are growing also in the future because of the optimum combination of market and government. While in the West we were able to grow on market forces mostly. But in many emerging markets now, they are growing on finding the optimum between market and government interference. They also have quite a different opinion on globalization. The growing economies, the emerging markets, they believe in globalization, for sure. They believe in a positive sum game. But at the same time, they believe also in national sovereignty and in strategic autonomy. And therefore they want to protect. They want to have the freedom to protect. So they are looking for the optimum combination of globalization and national sovereignty. Now, these elements are being put together in the book on the rise of the new economic powers and the changing global landscape. And I start the book with a quote that according to me, today's younger generation, they will be working and living and studying in a world for the first time in modern history, which is not dominated by the West anymore. And that is why I think we need to understand not only the catching up of these new economic powers, the emerging markets, including China, but also how they shape the future of globalization. Because the globalization process will be quite different, because now we have emerging markets that are able to shape the globalization process. And if you look at certain emerging markets like India or Brazil or Turkey, they also will do things differently than what China is doing. So by looking at these two angles, the Western point of view and the emerging markets point of view, I think we can learn a lot. And that may reduce misperceptions on what is happening on the other side of the world. It's clear that the economic relationship between China and the EU is very substantial, obviously, if you look at export flows, import flows. So international trade relation, bilateral trade relation is enormous. And again, I would say that is driven by the attitude of a positive sum game, that we can win. We have winners and winners in a sense. There is sensitivity on certain elements of sectors in international trade. For example, we believe in Europe that the prices of solar panels from China, that they are too low, and that companies are getting subsidies from the local government to reduce the price, and it is being dumped on the EU market. So there are clearly sensitivities happening. But in a sense, in this economic relationship, from an economic point of view, I still expect a positive sum game attitude and narrative on that. And we have to solve all these sensitivities for sure. But these are sensitivities on certain sectors, and sometimes very specific sectors. Now, there's also sensitivity in geopolitical arena. I always found that more difficult to solve, because a geopolitical issue relates to power. And power is automatically a zero-sum game. So if I have more power, you have less power. So there are winners and losers in power. And that makes the discussion on political globalization much more difficult than economic globalization. So I think, of course, we have sensitivities in economic globalization, But we can solve that. If you look at the next coming years, we will solve that step by step. We will hopefully be able to understand each other in many aspects, and that may help. But the discussion on political globalization, for example, in the IMF or the World Bank, is much more complicated, because there we have this zero-sum game. I think the One Belt, One Road initiative is very important for China, but also for many parts of the world. If you look at the main motives, the drivers behind this initiative, that is driven obviously also by domestic factors, like the excess of export and also finding markets in other parts of the world. And many parts of the world, they are also looking for capital and for investments, because they don't believe that they can borrow money from the IMF or the World Bank so easily anymore, and they have to follow all these conditions from the IMF and the World Bank. So for them it is also very attractive to ask China for finance and investments. Although the initiative is seen in the West as an building up China's activities in many neighboring countries, and hence to create a sort of Asian trading bloc or an Asian region, clearly it is should also be seen as an initiative for connecting to many other parts of the world, so from a global perspective. I think one element which we may underestimate is the importance of foreign direct investments by the Chinese based on this initiative in many parts of the world. Mostly the emphasis is on trade, but there's a lot of capital involved also. And luckily most of the countries, they are able to fine-tune their needs, to indicate their needs, and again they have options. They can go to the IMF, they can ask money from the World Bank, and they may ask also bilateral capital flows from China. And then it is up to these countries how they assess the pros and the cons. So it is an important initiative also for the rest of the world.
For up-to-date analysis and on-the-ground sentiments from China, click here to visit our website, thechinaacademy.org, and join our audience community of over 150 million followers.